Well, welcome everyone. My name is Adis Juderia, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Network of Spiritual Progressives Australia and the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore. As you know, the Network of Spiritual Progressives Australia and the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore have been co-hosting a series of webinars throughout this year, focusing on the issue of constructive conditions for interfaith dialogue, as theorized by Professor Catherine Cornell. And we are very excited that in this fifth installment, we are actually going to have Professor Cornell talking to us on one aspect of these conditions. Professor Cornell is also going to have discussants and people who are going to engage in dialogue with her presentation, which focuses in particular on the condition of empathy. We have discussed already previously in our previous webinars, we have discussed several other conditions that Professor Cornell has identified as being important or being crucial if we are to approach interfaith dialogue in a constructive manner. I would like to just spend a couple of minutes before I introduce Professor Cornell. I would like to spend a couple of minutes explaining as to why we have, why are we focusing on these constructive conditions and how this will come about. Well, it was around 2015, I believe. I was walking down the memory lane today, thinking about this as to when did I exactly come across Professor Cornell's excellent scholarship on interfaith dialogue theory. And I think it was around 2014, 2015, when I came across Professor Cornell's edited volume. I believe Blackwell Wiley Blackwell, I think they refer to it, I believe Publishing House, that published a really important volume edited by Professor Cornell on interfaith dialogue and the theory of interfaith dialogue. And of course, Professor Cornell, as I will I'll share her biography, very impressive biography, very soon. Professor Cornell is the leading scholar in this area of scholarly inquiry, and she has written extensively on interfaith dialogue theory, comparative theology. I was looking into Professor Cornell's work from the perspective of my own interest in interfaith dialogue theory. I myself have been very interested in this question of the relationship between the religious self and the religious other from the perspective of the Islamic interpretative traditions. I have done some work in this area myself, and actually in 2015 I published a journal article using Professor Cornell's wonderful theoretical framework and applying it to the Islamic tradition. As I said, I personally am very excited to have Professor Cornell being present with us today and taking time to address us, especially given the fact that this is 6 a.m. in very cold Boston, I believe, late autumn, late fall, as Americans would say. So we are really delighted to have you with us this evening. Of course, we are delighted to have a number of other highly respected scholars and practitioners of interfaith dialogue joining us from places such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So the remaining thing that I'm going to basically convey to you is just a brief biography of Professor Cornell that doesn't at all do justice to all the amazing work she has been doing in this space for a very, very long time. And once I have read out her short biography, I will pass the floor on to Professor Cornell to address us. So Professor Cornell is Professor of Comparative Theology at Boston College, where she holds the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture. Her areas of research focus on theology of religions, comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, and religious hybridity. She is the author of The Impossibility of Religious Dialogue, published back in 2008, and more recently, Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology. These are all monographs published in 2020, and she has edited a number of volumes, including many mentions, Multiple Religious Belonging and Christian Identity, going back to 2002, Interreligious Hermeneutics, published in 2010, and Women and Interreligious Dialogue in 2013. And the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, which is the first kind of encounter I have had with Professor Cornell's academic scholarship that was published back in 2013. And I believe her most recent monograph is Atonement and Comparative Theology. Importantly also, she is the founding and managing editor of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts. Again, Professor Cornell, I'm delighted to have you with us today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Duderija. It's a great honor for me to be here with you today, and a delight to hear that my work has had some impact, especially outside of the Christian world. The purpose of or the approach I have to interreligious dialogue is much more generic, meaning that even though I approach interreligious dialogue from a Christian perspective, the idea is to develop certain methods and criteria that are indeed relevant and applicable to other religious traditions. And so it's a particular pleasure and honor that you have been able to use those criteria or those conditions from a Muslim perspective. So that's for me a test case that what I have been doing has some relevance beyond the Christian tradition. So I'm delighted to hear this. So today I would like to focus on the topic of empathy, which has occupied me for quite some time and has particularly intrigued me. I think of all the conditions for dialogue that I have worked on, this is the one that is still sort of the most elusive to me, or that I feel like I have not at all gotten to the bottom of, and therefore am even more interested in than the other conditions. And I'm really looking forward to the responses to this presentation. Why am I intrigued and interested in the condition of empathy? Because religion is, after all, about experience. So interreligious dialogue, I sometimes say, is a communication or an exchange of experiences. We think too often, I think, of interreligious dialogue from a very heady, conceptual, rational perspective, or else from a ritual perspective. But I'm intrigued with how in interreligious dialogue we are or aren't able to access one another's deepest faith experience, which is ultimately what religions are about. And so I think in order to really understand the other, that possibility of empathy is a particularly relevant and important condition for genuine dialogue. So what I would like to do this morning is just reflect for a little while with you on what interreligious empathy is really about, how it can be generated, and what then the conditions are for genuine interreligious empathy, and what the challenges are. So my comments will be fairly brief. I think I have about 30 minutes, but I particularly look forward to your responses. So empathy, as I said before, always has to do with the affective dimension of interpersonal understanding. So in general, empathy has been defined as the affective response to the directly observed, imagined, or inferred emotional state of another being. Or else as the capacity to grasp the affective meaning of what is being studied and observed. So the interest in empathy, or the study of empathy, interestingly, is relatively late or early. So empathy as a category of study really emerged only roughly since the 18th or the 19th century, which of course doesn't mean that there wasn't any empathy before that. But it's not surprising that the interest in empathy has arisen in conjunction with the Enlightenment focus on the individual or the person. And with that interest in the subject or in the person came also an interest in personal feelings, personal emotions, and interpersonal emotional connection and understanding. In terms of interreligious empathy, there's sometimes, or I think there are two ways in which interreligious empathy can be understood. So it also, of course, has to do with grasping the experiential dimension of the teachings and practices of another religion. So it's grasping the experiential dimension of the teachings and practices of another religion. That's a very sort of summary understanding of what interreligious empathy is. But that in itself can be approached in two different ways. So you can understand this as focusing on an individual believer. So interreligious empathy is then an attempt to get a hold of the effective dimension of the teachings and practices of a particular person that you are in dialogue with. And that's how I think we usually understand interreligious empathy. So trying to really go a bit deeper and understand what is happening experientially, affectively in the person that we are engaged with in dialogue. But in a broader sense, I think you can also understand interreligious empathy as an affective response to the study of texts and practices of another religious tradition. So their interreligious empathy doesn't have to do so much with a particular individual and trying to understand the experience of this singular person, but rather trying to get affectively or experientially into the world of another religious tradition by reading their text or by participating in their rituals. So in the second case, interreligious empathy has more to do with my response to the text and practices of the other, rather than trying to get into the particular experience of another individual. Now, why is interreligious empathy interesting or important? I've already hinted at the fact, of course, that just in terms of mutual understanding or the attempt to get a full picture of the reality of another religious tradition, empathy forms such an important dimension of that reality, that understanding another religion requires some form of affective resonance with what is happening in another tradition, I believe. So, I mean, we understand that very well from our own perspective when we try to communicate to somebody from another religious tradition what we believe and what we practice. We don't just want to transmit sort of ideas and practices. We want to transmit an experience, which is ultimately at the heart of all religious traditions. So just as I would like another person to understand or to grasp the deepest experiential reality of my religion, so the other person obviously would like me to understand that from their perspective. So interreligious empathy therefore has, an important hermeneutic or intellectual or rational, you can say, or understanding dimension or to it that forms an important part of why empathy plays such an important role. But empathy also, I believe, has also an interreligious empathy has also an important ethical purpose to avoid conflict or violence. As we are all too sadly aware, religions are often used and will continue probably to be used to incite aggression and violence against the other. And empathy in general is usually seen as a form of aggression curber or as a helping accelerator. So if you are able to empathize with another person, meaning affirm the humanity of the other person and understand the other person as a whole person with also an emotional state, that is often a barrier against aggression and against violence against the other. So, of course, empathy can also be used in cruel and punishing ways in order to understand how you can punish the other. So to understand, for example, how a Christian relates to the Bible or a Muslim relates to the Quran, how you can desecrate that feeling or that relationship sometimes requires itself some empathy. So for somebody to desecrate the Bible requires them to understand how important the Bible is from a Christian perspective. So it's not a foolproof means to resist violence, but at least when you're able to affirm the humanity and understand the humanity of the other, that plays an important role in curbing interreligious violence. It's in the United States, for example, Martin Hoffman has pointed out that nothing has worked as well in order to reverse American attitudes towards African Americans as the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. So if you're able to get inside the feelings or the emotional state of the other, that tends to be an important way to curb violence. And also part of the ethical dimension is the fact that empathy plays an important role in the process of reconciliation between religious traditions. So even though we may not be directly guilty of what our ancestors may have done towards religious others, if we are able to empathize with the hurt that has been done to the other, that often is an important step towards reconciliation with another religious tradition. So in that sense, interreligious empathy, I think, plays also a very important ethical role. And then from the perspective of what we can genuinely learn from one another, I believe empathy also plays an important role, because in interreligious dialogue as a constructive reality, which is what we tend to call comparative theology, there will be only a tendency to really learn from the other if I'm able to resonate with particular experiences or feelings of the religious other. So teachings or practices that leave me cold will probably not lead to or will probably not motivate me to try to learn something new from what I have been observing. So that affective resonance with the experience of the other, in which I'm moved or touched or spiritually uplifted, that will also be an important touchstone for what I can learn from, or what I might want to learn from the other religious tradition. So in all these ways, I think empathy plays a very important role in interreligious dialogue. So, but how then do we proceed in the process of empathy? I mean, it's a very elusive faculty, as I've said before, and people tend to compare empathy more with an art rather than a science. But there are some ways, I think, in which we can try to get a little bit deeper into understanding how empathy functions. So what is required for empathy to be possible is a belief that there is a sort of foundational set of experiences and realities that are universal, that are kind of anthropological universals, and that form the basis for the possibility of us understanding the emotional or affective state of another human being. And of course, insofar as that is universal across religious traditions, and insofar as religions respond to profound, existential, universal religious needs and desires, empathy tends to proceed by way of understanding the deeper motivations underneath particular experiences. So all religions respond to universal needs and desires for hope and love and consolation, for as a sort of curbing of fear and desire for peace and so forth. So when we observe somebody from another religious tradition and try to empathize, it's often difficult to empathize with the direct experience itself, but if we are able to go beneath the experience and try to understand what the particular experience responds to in terms of fundamental religious desires or needs, I think that is a way in which we can get a grasp of maybe what the emotional or the affective dimension is of the experience of the other. But what's a little bit more complex is that religions aren't, of course, just responses to particular needs and desires. Religions themselves are a way to purify desires, as Nicholas Lash used to put it. You know, his definition of religion was religions being a purification of desire and a weaning of idolatry. So they're not just responses to desires, but they're also a matter of purifying desires and maybe creating a different set of desires and experiences. So in that sense, I think that type of refinement of desires requires also a very extensive immersion in the religious world of the other, in which we come to understand, first of all, how all of the teachings and practices of a particular religion affect an individual or generate particular feelings. So this is not just a matter of tapping into universal feelings, but trying to enter into the worldview and the life world of the other in order to awaken certain new feelings, certain new experiences within oneself. So I think those are the two ways in which empathy proceeds, either by way of universal common religious needs and desires, or else by way of immersing oneself in the life of the other so as to resonate and awaken certain religious desires or feelings within oneself. So that being the case, it's still true that empathy, interreligious empathy, is not, and I think we have to recognize that, is not a kind of natural orientation. So religions are by nature not inclined towards this desire to empathize with the religious other, because as we all know, religions are all claiming different and often contradictory ultimate truths that mean that the other religious tradition and its believers are in fact a threat to my own religious identity and claims. So this natural attitude towards the other is much more colored by antipathy than by sympathy. towards a religious other. So first of all, in order for empathy to be genuinely possible, that you can say natural attitude of antipathy has to turn into sympathy in one way or the other. So there has to be, for empathy to be possible, there has to be some sense of the internal plausibility, coherence, validity, possibly, of the religious beliefs and practices of another tradition. And that's, of course, a huge challenge, as I said. So empathy in some way requires also a doctrinal, you can say, or a theological transformation in which the other religious tradition is seen to possibly contain elements of truth and validity. And so interreligious empathy, therefore, demands of every religious tradition that they develop that kind of doctrinal openness, you can say, all the other conditions for dialogue that I have mentioned, doctrinal openness and receptivity towards the other tradition. So that, first of all, has to change. The attitude of antipathy has to change to an attitude of receptivity and sympathy towards the other religious tradition that comes with a kind of theological openness. A second condition for genuine dialogue is experience, personal experience. So this is also a tricky condition because even though I tend to empathize with the religious other by tapping into my own religious life and experiences and try to understand a kind of analogy between my own religious experiences and those of the others, there still has to be a kind of place or possibility for also gaining new experiences. And so we will go into that in a minute. As I said before, religious traditions have sort of cultivated or developed certain experiences or feelings or attitudes that are recurrent in most religious traditions. So experiences of fasting, of devotion, pilgrimage, prayer, meditation, compassion, all of these states or inner attitudes towards the divine are recurrent in different religious traditions. And so when I see, for example, a woman kneeling in front of a statue of Ganesha, for example, in the Hindu tradition, the way I will try to empathize with that experience is by drawing from my own experience of devotion to Christ or to the Virgin Mary or to a saint in my own religious tradition. And by analogy, I will use my own experience in order to empathize, to resonate affectively with what is going on in her particular experience. So it certainly is true that the more refined, complex, diverse one's own religious repertoire is, the easier it will be to resonate with experiences from other religious traditions. An interesting aspect of that is also that I think many of you will recognize that it's in fact sometimes easier to resonate with analogical experiences in another religious tradition than to resonate with experiences in one's own religious tradition that one really has not had access to in the past. So sometimes those types of experiences across religious traditions are more accessible than types of experiences within one's own religious tradition. However, so the question is then, is that the limit of possibility of interreligious empathy? Only those experiences that I have already had in my own tradition are accessible, or might I also have access to new religious experiences? And again, this is completely unforeseeable or unpredictable whether or not one will be able to really tap into experiences one hasn't had so far and open sort of a new register of experience through interreligious dialogue. But clearly, it's not impossible to access new types of religious experiences. And the proof of that is that people can convert from one religion to the other if they are suddenly awakened to new types of interiority or experience that they hadn't had in their prior religious tradition. So it's certainly true that it is possible, and the more sort of vital the experience, I think the more the possibility of empathy with new with new experiences. And that, of course, is also important for that question of learning. If all I can empathize with is experiences that I've already had, then there's no real possibility for accessing other ways of relating to the divine. And so it's particularly important, I think, in interreligious dialogue to consider whether and how we can really resonate with experiences we haven't had so far. And that's where I think the third condition for interreligious dialogues plays such an important role, and that is the third condition for empathy, and that is the imagination. So imagination is, again, sort of an incredibly unpredictable and elusive capacity. But first of all, what I want to point out is that imagination plays a central role in all religious experience. In one's own tradition, it is through the imagination that we are able to conceive of realities beyond this world and tap into experiences that have to do with a completely other state of being. So it is, the imagination is at the heart of all religious traditions. So this means also that the imagination may also possibly be used, even though the imagination tends to be limited to the imaginary world of one's own religious tradition, the very beliefs and practices of one's own religion can also serve to possibly think of an imaginary world that is otherwise. So if I believe, for example, in a personal God, that very belief in a personal God can maybe also trigger the possibility of an impersonal God. Or if my belief in God is very much male gendered, that very particularity can also refer beyond itself to other possibilities of female gendered God or gods. So every particular imagination, I think, can trigger the possibility to imagine an other transcendent, an other understanding of the transcendent reality and other ways of being religious. However, the imagination also itself requires, of course, a deep knowledge of the other tradition. So the imagination is also something that can also very easily run wild, and one can project all of one's own imaginary world onto the other. So for the imagination to help us enter into the genuine experience of the other, this requires, of course, a deep understanding or knowledge of the other tradition in their particularity or in their difference. And in order for the imagination to be awakened or stimulated, another important resource we have is to participate in the religious life and practice of the other. It's a remarkable fact in the world of religion how being in a particular place and being surrounded by particular people and having the senses stimulated in a particular way, how important that is to bring about experience. A friend of mine shared experiences that he had when he was doing field work, for example, in Africa with the Maasai. And he was talking about how when he was living with the Maasai and practicing with the Maasai in Africa, he very spontaneously spoke in tongues often. And once he's out of that environment, once he's out of that living context, there is no more speaking in tongues. It's the same, with, I'm sure you all have examples of how being in a particular environment, having the senses stimulated by smell and hearing and touch, and the collective experience of a community, how that itself plays a very important role in awakening particular experiences. So participation in the ritual life of the other, it plays a very important role in stimulating the imagination and also steering it in a particular way, so that our imagination doesn't just go wild. So all of these elements, I think, play an important role in interreligious empathy, and point also to the challenge of interreligious empathy. So even though, as I pointed out in the beginning, interreligious empathy plays such an important role, it's also not a self-evident capacity. So there are all kinds of challenges of, as I pointed out, a kind of natural antipathy towards the other, a sense that what the other believes is incredible, not believable. There are the limits of our own experience. There are limits of participation in the religious life of the other also. You can say that, interreligious participation in one's ritual life is important, but very often one is excluded from what is most sacred or what is most holy in the religious life of the other. When I go into Hindu temples, very often I cannot go into the most sacred place of a Hindu temple. And in the same way as non-Christians participate in the Eucharist, for example, they're very welcome, but they cannot participate in what is most sacred about the Eucharist, namely, or about the Mass, namely the reception of the Eucharist. So there are limits to interreligious participation, and therefore also to genuine or full interreligious empathy. And then, of course, what I haven't mentioned yet is the fact that experience is conditioned or shaped by a particular faith. So I can say that if I try to empathize with the experience of a Hindu woman, I use my experience of devotion to Christ to imagine what is going on in her experience. But of course, her experience is shaped by the particular devotion she has, just as my experience is shaped by the particular devotion that I have for Christ. So it's not just devotion. That devotion is filled with a particular content. And that is, of course, not accessible for somebody who doesn't have the faith. So that's always a problem in interreligious empathy, that what is missing is that element of faith, which is at the heart of every experience, of course. So there are a lot of obstacles for interreligious empathy, but I don't find that insurmountable. On the one hand, I think those obstacles also remind us or may generate in us a kind of proper humility and recognition of the genuine alterity of the other. And I think that is a healthy thing to keep in mind. And on the other hand, I think, even though perfect empathy with the experience of the other may be impossible because of that element of faith, the very attempt or desire to empathize with the experience of the other, I think, can be incredibly enriching for the relationship with the religious other, or for interreligious relationships, but also for one's own spiritual life. Even if my experience of empathy is not a a duplication of the experience of the other, it does open me up for new registers of religious feeling and emotion, and may enrich my emotional or experiential religious life just by the effort to enter into the life of the other or into the experience of the other. So it just can broaden my experiential repertoire and help me discover new experiences within myself. So as you can see, this topic of empathy is incredibly complex and will take me a lifetime, I think, to continue to ponder and explore, but it fascinates me, and I really look forward to the responses to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Professor Cornell, thank you so very much for this, dare I say, tour de force on the topic. I have the inevitable task of trying to summarize all the wonderful insights you've conveyed to us. And of course, I'm going to fall short of doing that. One of the most, and there have been many moments where I've had epiphanies, if I could use that word, when you were talking and talking to us about interfaith empathy. But you started off by emphasizing the idea that I find very personally meaningful, namely that religion is all about experience. And therefore, the interreligious dialogue is about experience or sharing or exchange of experiences. That's something that I strongly agree with. And as a fan of process theology, I see a lot of affinities here with the way the process theologians have thought about religion from a philosophical perspective in particular, but also theologically. We've also emphasized this idea that interfaith dialogue and empathy is about affective dimension of the human experience. It's about exchanging, it's about, I guess, going into the emotional state of the religious sada and trying to understand them at the deepest, most personal level. And of course, you mentioned that there are other elements of interreligious empathy, such as trying to understand the practices and the sacred texts of the religious sada. Another topic that fascinated me, or that I found particularly interesting, is this idea of the limits to empathy. That that there are certain limits within which we can perhaps find it extremely difficult to empathize with the specific and particular experiences that the religious other might have in relation to a particular faith tenet that they kind of adhere to. And I was also taken quite strongly by this idea that empathy, and perhaps here is where I might have a question for you, that empathy in the context of interfaith dialogue is not a natural state of affairs. And I was wondering in that sense, and you've talked about the concept of empathy in general and how it hasn't really been studied much, and it was only with the advent of enlightenment where the emphasis on the individual feelings and individual emotions, that's where empathy started to be studied academically in earnest. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. I mean, a little bit of research that I have done or not research, some of my readings that are not particularly related to my academic pursuits. I was really fascinated by a recent book titled The Humankind. And this word kind, of course, could mean the humankind as a generic term, but also human being, us being kind, meaning the basic premise here is that we are hardwired hardwired for being, for kindness and solidarity, and that's like evolutionary speaking. We seem to be hardwired, and the way we organize our societies and the way we have evolved, the idea of being kind to one another, showing solidarity to the other, seems to have been an important kind of evolutionary trait, or of course, not just an evolutionary, but from the perspective of those of us who have a theological, a theistic worldview, we would say that perhaps God is, an ultimate reality is what is guiding this evolutionary trajectory. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think that this idea of empathy that I've just talked about, that people, let's say from a biological perspective, evolutionary perspective, to what extent is it in conflict with what you've just talked about in relation to the idea that empathy is not a natural condition when it comes to interfaith dialogue? Because, as you said, religions make certain claims, they are based on certain tenets that they consider non-negotiable. So how does that play itself out? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your kind comments and responses. Yes, this question is an interesting one in terms of whether empathy is or is not a natural state. And there has been research done also on empathy in the animal world. And clearly, empathy also exists in the animal world. Frans de Waal has done quite a bit of research on that. Martin Hoffman, there's quite a bit of work now recently on ethics and morality and empathy that is very helpful for understanding also interreligious empathy. So empathy also exists in the animal world, but what is clear in the animal world is that animals also tend to, or some animals that practice empathy also exist in certain tribal kind of situations where clearly there is empathy towards the in-group, but not so much towards the out-group. So kindness and empathy will maybe a natural state of survival also within particular groups, but there is also sort of a sense of animosity or a threat that still exists from out groups that don't share the sort of ethos of the in-group. And that's where I think the limits of empathy show themselves also. So that's an interesting sort of finding also for interreligious. I mean, of course, it depends how we define the religious other. Are they really an out group or an in group? That's why I'm saying that a kind of theological openness towards the other and towards a sense of commonality or religious receptivity towards the other and respect for the other and so on, that breaks sort of the barriers of in-group and out-group, is important for interreligious empathy. So kindness, yes, and empathy, yes, but tends to be practiced mostly within a particular tribe or within a particular group. So I think there's still sort of a barrier to overcome there in order for that to be extended to the religious other.
It's a very fair point, very fair point. Thank you so much. Allow me now to hand over the baton to my wonderful colleague, the co-director of the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore, Mohammed Imran, who is going to now take over the torch, so to speak, and guide us through the rest of this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Adis, and thank you so much, Professor Catherine. I think that was really a very insightful presentation by you. I have a few questions running through my mind, but I'll keep that for the question and answer later. But I do take note that it's very interesting that we are Zooming from 6 different countries, and I do empathize with your time there, which is almost 7 a.m. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us such an early morning. And also I do empathize with my colleague also, Dr. Adis, It's rather late now in Brisbane, in Australia. And I think for those of us here in Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, we only start to, our minds start to work only after 9 p.m. All right, so we have heard a lot of theoretical insights into the idea of interreligious empathy. I think it's also important for us now to see how that works out on the ground and in practical terms. And of course, the three commentators that we have today, people who have been very active on the ground and working in interreligious dialogue and displaying a lot of empathy on the ground, connecting communities, and building communities themselves. So I would like to first introduce Reverend Dr. Herman Shastri, a friend of mine, who is a religious practitioner, a social justice advocate, and an interfaith peace builder. Reverend Herman holds a PhD in sacred theology from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and currently he serves as the General Secretary in the Council of Churches Malaysia, and he serves on national, regional, and international bodies that promote ecumenism, interfaith initiatives for justice and peace, and also on climate change. He was the Deputy Chair of the Special Committee of Interfaith Relations and Harmony of the Ministry of Unity of the Malaysian government for over 10 years. So we have a very experienced scholar advocate with years of working with communities on the ground in promoting justice, peace, and interfaith relations. So over to you, Reverend Herman.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I greet all the others on the panel, and most especially Professor Catherine Cornell. And I just want to begin by saying that I found what she had to share very meaningful, and in many ways resonates with much of the experiences that I have gathered through all these years in the field of interfaith relations. But I think it would not be doing justice to Professor Catherine, because we have given her only one subject to speak on, empathy. But in her book on from 2008, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, she speaks about 5 fundamental conditions to promote meaningful interreligious dialogue. And I think empathy is one of those, but all of the other aspects, humility, commitment, interconnection, hospitality or generosity, all these are intertwined, and one reinforces the other. And so therefore, I would receive the points that she has made today, recalling back the wonderful read I had of a book and the rich insights there. And she has called for continuous critical self-examination. So there's an internal process that we need to be critical about the experiences we try to conceptualize and relate it to religious dogma, and also the creative retrieval of resources that may open our own tradition to the religious other. And I think this is a very pertinent insight, and from this basis, I will approach some of the points she has raised. I think firstly, the word empathy, sympathy, compassion, are these just purely philosophical categories, or are these basic human categories that resonate in every human heart, and it goes beyond the attempt of categorization by religious experts or scholars. And I think the case in point here would be the context in which I come from, or in many parts of the world too, where there have been centuries of coexistence among different religions. There are good examples of such coexistence contributing to harmony and deeper insight about each other's traditions. And there have been areas of conflict, but if there are areas of conflict, much of the factors that contribute to that conflict may not be coming from religion, but may be interpretation or an insertion of a hermeneutic that produces a fear of the other. So I think that is the first point I want to make. And I think empathy comes naturally to us as human beings. And if we grow up, say in my own context in Malaysia, there is no way that we are going to be unaware of the religious other, because they may be in our neighborhood, they may be in our schools, they may be in our religious festivals that we celebrate with one another. And so there is only a natural curiosity that develops as one grows up about why a temple, a person professing the Hindu faith would be doing something, or celebrate the birth of a child in a certain way and the rituals that go with it, and so on and so forth. So there is a rich inter-religious experience already inbuilt in the context that one comes from. So empathy is quite a natural factor. So for example, you can, in these days of the pandemic, there have been interfaith action to provide food banks, to mobilize people to go to vaccination centers. And this has gone beyond just strict religious communities. It has brought the people together, bound by a religious faith. And even when the prayers that they are saying, they're not just praying for their own people, but also for the well-being of the whole nation made up of different religions and races. So this is a thing that needs to be highlighted. And I think it also feeds into the whole tradition of celebrating the fruits of interreligious coexistence. So we have towards a global ethic, which has become sort of an academic and also, of course, a compassionate call from religious leaders, the Parliament of World Religions from 1993, and how they have, in their call for the commitments, picked up some of the points saying, and one of those, of course, is also empathy, respect, and tolerance for the other, and as a solidarity with those who suffer. And then, of course, in 2005, we have the Alliance of Civilizations of the United Nations, and in many of that things that they are saying there also resonates with many interfaith initiatives. And of course, the Charter of Compassion in 2009 under the leadership of Karen Armstrong. So I think here we have a very clear resource upon which we can draw, and it's not as complicated as we want to make it, because there are many places where there is this ability. The question, I think, is how do the religious institutions or those who call upon themselves to negotiate or go into dialogue with other religious groups, understand this aspect of empathy. And I think that's where it becomes an issue, because it raises the questions of the boundaries of doctrine. And I think no discussion on, of course, there's a fruitful discussion about empathy because it celebrates the humanness, the ability of religions to come together, but it does not do justice if we do not talk about the roadblocks that are placed upon interreligious dialogue by religious leaders or institutions. And again, there's a whole lot of history, and I come from the Christian side, and we have the ecumenical movement. So many of the things that we have done speak about this importance. So for example, if you're talking about racism, then one of the ways to talk about racism is also admission that racism is not a religious category. Racism is not at the heart of the faith that we profess, in my case, Christianity. And that, of course, puts us up against the other. But then in relating in empathy with the others, we would often take up the example of reconciliation in South Africa, for example, where you don't compromise the aspect of truth, the actual truth of social realities that has oppressed people, divided people, subjugated people, demonized people. And then, of course, the reconciliation. For the reconciliation, there must be the truth-telling, and then to find categories within religious experience that can help us move forward with mercy and forgiveness. So I think these are some of the interesting aspects. Of course, I can speak a bit more on that, but I want to allow for more discussion on this matter. And so thank you. I think empathy, without empathy, I don't think the religious claims of any one religious tradition can hold in our world that is so polarized today. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. Again, very rich insights. It's interesting you mentioned how the various communities, religious or racial communities in Malaysia have been coexisting for generations.
Yes.
And therefore, it's a display of empathy in its natural forms. But you also mentioned that possibly in more recent times, it's currently being eroded by insertion of a particular way of thinking or interpretation of religion. But at the same time, also you offer some hope, because the pandemic especially has opened up avenues for people to actually display great empathy in helping each other and things like that. And I think this needs to be highlighted even more. And of course, there are clear resources around the world that we can leverage on, and the Charter of Compassion by Karen Armstrong is one of those that you mentioned. So thank you so much for all those points. We'll move on to Indonesia now. Let me introduce Sapri Saleh. And before that, I would like to apologize on behalf of Dr. Budi Munawar Rahman, who was unable to make it due to unforeseen circumstances. So thank you so much, Sapri, for, maybe I should call you Ustaz Sapri, for joining us at such a last minute notice. But of course, Ustaz Sapri is very well known in Jakarta. He's a member of the Nahdlatul Ulama Batsul Masail Institute in Jakarta. And he's the go-to person when you want to know things about Muslim-Jewish relations in Indonesia. He's an Indonesian specialist in Middle Eastern cultures. And he received his education in Arabic literature in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. And at the same time, he studied Hebrew at the Israeli Cultural Center. Since 2016, he has been teaching English, Hebrew, and Arabic languages and cultures. He is active with Indonesian Conference on Religion and Peace, which is a non-profit, non-sectarian, and non-governmental organization dedicated to advancing and promoting interfaith dialogues democracy and peace in Indonesia. Ustaz Sapri has a wide experience in the field of intercultural relations and has worked in diplomatic offices in Lebanon and New York. And in 2016, he published, I believe it's the first of such publication, Hebrew, Indonesian, and Indonesian Hebrew Dictionary. And he's now active in bridging the divide between Muslims and Jews and aims to bring peace and understanding and certainly empathy between the two communities. Please, Ustaz.
Thank you very much, Brother Muhammad Imran. I think the decision that I'm here tonight is part of the empathy too. No, wow, what is introductions that you give it to me, Muhammad Imran, my brothers. Thank you very much. I'm delighted and feel honored to be one of the responders to the Professor Catherine Cornell in the webinar tonight. Thank you, Muhammad Imran, for inviting me in the last minutes. He called me like last minute, 12 o'clock midnight yesterday. But Imran and I have been advocating moderation and religion, respecting other faith, not only among Abrahamic faith, but also to the other religion. Tonight, there is no doubt that Professor Catherine Cornell brought us an important topic. Spreading, if I don't misunderstand that, spreading empathy under the umbrella of religion, which is most of us here are considered themselves believer in God. I would like to emphasize something, that the empathy is the most profound mark of the true believer, if you would like to consider yourself as a believer. We are in Indonesia, religion is a very important element in our daily life. Unfortunately, the issue, I don't know, this is my experience, the topic like empathy is very rarely to be brought up into discussions like tonight. We all believe that any religion, without exceptions, teach us the empathy in its doctrine, Islam, I think any religion. But unfortunately, this is what happened in reality. This is what I face also in my daily activity in Jakarta. We all want sympathy from others, but sometimes we often fail to pay it back. And it's a lot of I believe Mr. Imran invited me tonight over here because he knows that my daily activity is engaging with other religions, especially in Christianity and Judaism. I teach Hebrew. I would like to share my empathy as a person, as a Muslim, to teach Hebrew, to teach the most sacred text and the holy book, which is considered in originally text in Hebrew. We read together, we try to understand what the context of the text itself in the original language, without feeling any barriers, and then giving a wonderful feeling being together. And I think such of activity should be one of our program in the future, not only a discussion, but also we practicing in the reality of life. Our government in Indonesia, government and the stockholders promoting the promoting moderation of religion, because we believe that the promotion of religion also would bring people to the empathy to understand others. As Indonesian Muslim, and then I'm coming from the Nahdlatul Ulama organizations. We advocate many stakeholders to promote scientific tolerance and to other religions. It comes in my mind before. It's very interesting from a presentation from Professor Catherine Cornell. I would like to also asking how you will, Professor, acting to the victims, because this is what I experienced in Indonesia. I faced some of the victims of violations, of the victims of in an empathy, yeah, the victims in empathy in terms of in interreligious relations. When we approach them, Professor, I would like to ask a question before I forget that. To approach them, some of Indonesians in Indonesia, they are victims of in empathy. So it's very hard to approach them. What could you suggest us in Indonesia to solve this kind of problem? Because I believe, Ms. Professor, that the empathy that you experience in United States, as what you are now, are different that we are facing in Indonesia. So most that my experience facing with the Indonesian people are the victims. You know, when I approach them and then being learning together, they won't believe me. You know, they don't trust with my empathy. What should be done with this kind of the situation? I think this kind of I will not talk too much. I will, we let the later on in discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sapri. Again, I think you have raised some very interesting points. Of course, in Indonesia, religion is a very important element, and therefore positioning empathy as a mark of a true believer is crucial if within a very religious society, right? So you can't say that you are religious without showing empathy. So that was your first point, I believe. But you also raised about the issue of hypocrisy, that sometimes we want empathy to be shown towards us, but we do not show empathy towards others. And one very interesting suggestion you raised is about reading the sacred text together to understand together, and also there has been some initiatives like scriptural reasoning. There's also the idea of listening to the echo of the sacred text together. So these are things that we can explore together as part of the interfaith community. And I think the question you have for Professor Catherine, which later I hope she can respond, is how do we deal with the victims in society? Yeah. If I get you right, for example, violations against the religious minorities, and when you approach them, it's and trying to show empathy, their response of being victimized and being victims would be quite different, yeah. And how do we breach that? Yeah. So that's a very interesting point for us to ponder, and I hope Professor Catherine can respond to that later on. All right, we'll move on to the next commentator or discussant, and she's a colleague of mine, Kay Chew Lin, from the Center for Interfaith Understanding, and she's a board member of the center. And Chew Lin has been involved in the dialogue space in Singapore for more than a decade, and as a secular humanist, she has experienced firsthand the personal and social consequences when individuals and communities do not want to or unable to listen to each other. Conversely, an intention of respect and collaboration can create an environment where diverse members can help each other to thrive. So certainly her perspectives here, as she noted, has been shaped by her experience in futures and foresight and design thinking, as well as her experiences at Harvard Divinity School where she graduated with Masters of Divinity degree. On a personal level, she's a spiritual health clinician in a local hospice, and she gets to experience the humbling intimacy of listening and exchange with people facing the end of their lives. Chulin hopes to create many more opportunities for people to experience the connection of dialogue, and that's why she's a very valuable member of the board at the Center for Interfaith Understanding. So over to you, Chulin.
Thank you, Imran. Listening to Professor Catherine and to Herman and to Sapri, it's been really interesting to reflect on the serendipity that dialogue as a format comes up with, because I think the last question that Ustad Sapri asked was, what do we do about people or about communities who don't trust the empathy that we offer them and don't trust our invitation to show empathy to each other. And I think in the course of our conversation, we've already started to answer that question. You know, Reverend Herman raised the example of the food bank that various communities have come together. And I'm not going to assume I know what Professor Catherine might tell us later on, but I thought I want to appreciate this as a really lovely lead-in to what I want to say, that I think we're already starting to answer each other's question, but Ustad Sapri's question is also very valuable, because we've spent all of this evening or all of this morning talk about the positive impact of empathy, to talk somewhat about how that can be made possible, but we've not really taken seriously the question of what is going on when we say no. And I want to spend a little bit of time just unpacking that a little. I will make no promises that I have any answers for any of us at all, but I think it's an important question for us to take seriously, because it's very easy, I think, sometimes for us to say, oh, that's hypocrisy, that's mean, you don't want to, you don't want to be a good neighbor, you don't want to show hospitality, when that's not necessarily the case. So I do want to sort of unpack a little what is behind the no, and what is it that we're saying no to, and what is it that we're saying yes to, we being a universal we, rather than, me specifically, for example. Because I think we also want to think about empathy from I think what we understand clinically at this point. We want to think about empathy from the point of view of personal experience, as well as the point of view of community identity. So over here, I just want to bring in the concept of empathic distress. And I think in sort of everyday parlance, we can sometimes call it burnout. It's particularly common in the circle that I move in. I work in healthcare. We talk about provider burnout all the time. And in some circles, it's more correctly known as empathic distress, in the sense that if we understand empathy in everyday terms as I feel your pain, empathic distress is I feel your pain so much that I cannot function anymore, right? And that is a real risk that we want to think about. So then when we think about overwhelm as a possibility as to why people are saying no, then we want to think about perhaps the differentials in experience of the various communities that we're trying to bring in together, both in terms of, if we're bringing in, as Reverend Herman was talking about the experiences of racism, we can bring in communities that have very different experiences. We just need to be very careful about the emotional labor that is involved, that whose pain are we asking to be put on display, and do the listeners have the tools to actually adequately hold the pain? Because it's one thing to say we should hold empathy to each other, it's hardwired into our nervous systems, but there are some experiences that are so big and so painful that if you don't scaffold that adequately, then you're basically setting the encounter up to fail, and worse, we're setting it up to fail in a way that we cannot recover until very much later, right? The other thing that we want to think about what people are saying no to is the is the question of existential crisis, right? I mean, I work in hospice. We talk about existential crises all the time, because there is no running away, right? Next week, this patient's not going to be there. But in an everyday sort of context, an existential crisis is something that you could technically run away from by just not talking about it. And why would you put yourself in that position of distress if we could go around our everyday lives without having to ask the question about am I sure I understand my truth as fully as possible? Am I okay with my identity in myself or my identity in my tribe? If my understanding changes or if my allegiance starts to change a little, right? I studied with Frank Clooney when I was at HDS, and I've been thinking about his idea of exitus reditus, right? Stepping out from the tradition where you are, encountering the other the best that you can, and coming back. And I've been thinking about what happens when the possibility of not coming home is actually very real, or that I come back to a self that I no longer recognize from where I currently stand, right? And for some people, it's a very abstract sort of philosophical question, but for others, this is the basis of their identity. This is the basis of their community. They don't just lose a particular self-concept; they're losing social connections, and that means something, and that's not something that we can necessarily ask people to do. And I think the question that Ustaz Sapri starts to ask is about boundaries and reciprocity, which I talked about briefly at the beginning, that empathy does need, I think, to be reciprocal at some level, because otherwise one party will feel particularly vulnerable and particularly disempowered, and that is a bit of a problem. So I think I've sort of unpacked some of the reasons why a no is possible, and I do think it's important for us to talk about that, partly because it avoids to a certain extent the danger of othering the other, or depersonalizing the other, because then, well, that we can't connect anymore because I think you're a terrible person for not wanting to sit down to engage, and that's not something that we want to do. But also, once we can sort of unpack some of this, then we can rethink, how do we want to scaffold the road to the table? And I thought it was particularly lovely that Reverend Herman brought up the example of the food bank, because another way of understanding that example is that it's a compassionate response from a diverse community to say, we have a common problem. I am invested in making sure that we alleviate this problem. And from there, we find that common basis to start to talk about other things. If you care about my hunger, what else could we care about together? And in a way, very embodied, very practical problems can be a much safer place to get into something a bit more abstract, a little bit more complicated, a little bit more fraught. So yeah, I think that's basically, what I do want to say, that the no's are very important, that we should pay attention to the no's, that scaffolding is very important to bring people to the table. And my own personal piece about this is that feeling in together is a start. We start with empathy and we work with compassion, because alleviation is what lifts us all up. Alleviation is what gives us hope, and that's what allows us to continue together. Back to you, Imran.
Thank you. I think that's a very good segue to the discussion that we're going to have now. Can I get all the commentators to also on your videos? Chulin, you raise a very important point about asking what's going on when people say no to empathy. And I think that deserves a bit more investigation. And it's interesting that you also introduced this term, maybe not you, but you introduced this term in today's session about emphatic distress. And it's about, sometimes how I feel your pain that I cannot function anymore, because hear it almost at the everyday level. So how do we deal with that, and how do we respond to that also? And yes, building on Ustad Sapri's point also, the painful experiences sometimes creates situations where people can't talk about it. And I was also thinking, as I listened to you, whether it's a privilege to be able to empathize with the other. Yeah. And what we sometimes do not ask is the relationship between the empathizer and the empathized. And in that relationship, sometimes, there are power dynamics that we have to investigate a little bit more. But you did point to one way forward, which is about looking at common problems and what do we care together about. And that can be the starting point for further conversations and develop relationships between communities. So thank you so much for all those very interesting insights. Now, let's get to the Q&A. Before that, I want to invite Professor Catherine to maybe briefly give your thoughts on what has been raised so far, including Sapri's question about how do we deal with that part of victims of, society.
So first of all, I want to thank you so much for your responses, and they sort of confront me with the reality of my positionality in the academy, thinking of this in very abstract theoretical terms, whereas you experience it on the ground in all kinds of existential ways, in very real sense that are very important reminders for me also about how to address this question. I just want to sort of, first of all, emphasize the difference between empathy and sympathy. So I think what Herman Shastri was talking about was also a lot that sympathy is something that maybe comes naturally to a religious person. I think Sapri Saleh was also talking about empathy or sympathy being the strongest mark of a religious believer and so on. I fully agree with that as the ideal. What I'm looking at is just sort of, my question is really, when I look at somebody from another religious tradition, when I look at a woman doing her rakaz or a man doing rakaz in the mosque, my question is just, how can I enter into that experience? And, how can I know more than just the fact that you have to pray 5 times a day and you do it by bowing and so on? What I'm questioning is, I want to understand what the affective, deepest religious feeling is that this person experiences. So that's really my question, not so much. So I fully agree with the fact that there are all kinds of levels on which we can empathize or sympathize with each other, in dealing with crises together, in coming together to solve social problems and so on. So there are levels of existence, I think, in which there's a lot of possibility for basic human empathy. What I'm my question is really, can I understand what is happening inside another religious person, and how can I go into their deepest religious experience? So it's a slightly different question than the questions of coexistence, in which we can, of course, find each other on all kinds of levels. We are human beings and we are more than just our religious identity. I can empathize with people from other religious traditions on the level of motherhood and childbirth and a child rearing, all kinds of levels at which I can empathize. But my question is particularly sort of their religious identity, and how can I just sort of really come to that kind of core. Now, the question of power is fascinating and really important, and I totally agree. And I think that was sort of at the basis of some of the questions that Chulin raised and Sapri Saleh. So it is sort of, I do realize that it might be threatening also for the subject of empathy to have somebody even try to come into their experience, or what is required in terms of the social and political circumstances for me to try to enter into that experience, and to which extent is that very effort sort of threatening for the insider, somebody trying to understand my experience. I mean, being from maybe a large dominant religion, it's a kind of luxury question, maybe, to, you know, the idea of entering into the experience and trying to understand them from within. The whole question of burnout and existential crisis and empathic distress, I think, is a really fascinating one, sort of in as a social reality, and is really something that I'd like to think about also more from a religious point of view, whether that would also be something to consider also in interreligious empathy, whether you can enter so far in the experience of the other that you don't come back. And maybe that's what happens when people convert to another religious tradition, that they really go so deeply into it and feel so identified with a particular experience in another religion that they don't come back, that there is no reditus indeed, and that they lose their own social reality and social context. These are just sort of some things that come up. I don't want to take too much time because there may be other questions that come up, but thank you so much for your responses, and they're certainly important to consider.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe if I can just put it bluntly, and hope you can just answer this in simple terms for our viewers. What will you say to someone who says, okay, empathy is part of human emotions or part of being human? Can I have empathy of another person, as a human being, without necessarily having empathy for their ideas, their religious ideas and practices? Is that something that can be decoupled or not? It's kind of a way of saying, well, you love the person, hate this, love the sinner, hate the sin kind of approach. Is that something that is possible or not?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think, as I said, we are complex human beings, and we can empathize with others on different level of our being and of our existence. So there are many ways in which we can connect with one another and empathize with certain aspects of our being. But my question was very particularly in terms of religious empathy, whether that is possible and to which extent, and what the conditions are for that in particular. So yes, the answer is yes. Very.
Yeah, and of course, for interreligious empathy to occur, like what you have mentioned, it requires some kind of doctrinal or theological openness. So thank you. There's a couple of questions from the audience. There's a very fascinating question. Professor Cornell used the term affective resonance as opposed to an intellectual resonance in the context of engaging the religious other and texts. Is this related to aesthetic value, which is intrinsic and immediately felt? And accordingly, does ethical value presuppose some kind of aesthetic value? And the question, therefore, should we focus on what constitutes the beautiful rather than the good? So I think that's an interesting way of flipping the coin. Yeah, what do you think about that?
It's a really complex and interesting question. I do think that aesthetics plays an important role in interreligious empathy also. And different religious traditions, of course, cultivate different types of aesthetics that, affective resonance is still something different from aesthetic resonance, I think. So it plays a role in it, and aesthetics can be both a means and a hindrance, I think, to interreligious empathy. But it's interesting, the term empathy itself started with a discussion of aesthetics and resonance to beauty and how that comes about. So it's an interesting segue into this question. So I do think that it plays an important role, I don't think it's the same as affective resonance. So I think if there is no aesthetic resonance, there may not be any affective resonance either. But that doesn't mean that that it's a necessary condition for all affective resonance. I can resonate with somebody's experience, and I think take some abstraction of my taste, my aesthetic taste, in order to enter into the particularity of the relationship of the other to their aesthetic context. So it's an interesting question that I'm certainly going to ponder some more, the role of aesthetics in empathy.
Thank you. There's a question, but I'm trying to empathize with not directing everything to Professor Catherine. But this one I will ask Reverend Herman instead, because you also touched a little bit about the justice, the issues of justice. So maybe you can elaborate in your experience how empathy can play a part in justice and human rights issues, and to what extent can empathy protect us from prejudices, blame, and judgment, and how do we promote this empathy at a broader scale? So, what are your thoughts on that, Reverend?
Yeah, I think the returning to a common basis of our common humanity, the fraternity of the human community, peaceful coexistence, nationhood, all these words are sociological, political, economic framework that you can use to engage with that. So it's nothing religious there. But I think it becomes problematic in religion, and especially when you take it in the perspective of empathy, is the kind of hermeneutic that comes into play. So you only have the hermeneutic of suspicion, and that is then entrenched, embedded, encouraged, promoted, or you have the hermeneutic of openness and of care that challenge your very own perceptions of religion. And I think that's where the fascinating tension is. So I think the word victim was used. So that's very interesting in the global discussions that we have of Christians living in different contexts. Who says to whom? The victim, and then where in your sacred scripture do you draw? So you can draw a very negative aspect to it, and almost exemplify victimhood as part and parcel of a religion, that you are meant to suffer, and only in the end, when the world ends, all the bad people will be sent to hell or things like that. So you could have this kind of notion. So I think it's very interesting in research that we do is always to interrogate the language that is used, how it's appropriated on the level of those who are the actual recipients of that victimization in a context, and then how the leaders, political leaders, the religious leaders, the scholars appropriate texts, whether it's in oral form or whether it's in scriptural form, to describe that. And that's where I think all this charter of compassion and global ethic comes into play. One principle you apply is that if you don't want something to be done to you, then you don't do it to others, or if you love God, then you do not hate your neighbor, But then of course, there's also the principle of loving your enemy, and how is that negotiated? And so in our churches, we struggle with that phenomena from generation to generation. Of course, we draw from the rich experiences of our churches who have lived through wars, lived through interfaith struggles, and so on and so forth. So I think the hermeneutics is a very important point. I think what Professor is sharing, and there you can draw and see from which context is coming on, what shaped his biography, and the language that he used, is it understood outside of that context? the two partners in the dialogue, are they understanding each other in the language?
Thank you. Those are very useful points. Ustaz Sapri has to leave very soon, but we will just extend this for maybe about at most 10 minutes more. But before he leaves, I want to ask a question with regards to his work in bridging the Muslim-Jewish relations. So I know you've asked that question to Professor Catherine, but let me now ask you instead, in your work, when you approach the Muslim community and say you must empathize with the Jewish situation, and then they will mention the atrocities done by the other side, and it goes both ways. Yeah, you talk to the Muslims, then they will talk about atrocities done towards the Muslims by the Israelis, for example, or you talk to the Jews and the Israelis, then they will also talk about the atrocities by the Arabs and the Muslims. So how do you deal with this in your pragmatic way of dealing with the two communities? Sorry, you have to unmute.
Thank you for the question, Muhammad Imran. Sometimes I have to take like, this funny, something that I will never expected, that my audience, the reality of my audience is different. That's why I said before to Catherine that the empathy that you have that in the United States are really different than when you implement it in my country, in Indonesia, especially people are, how should I explain that? People, some area neighborhood in Indonesia, because Indonesia is such a big country, they never experience living with the others, with other religions. And they never see even how other religion practicing. And while I'm coming to promote kind of empathy, teaching them or reading together the Torah or Bibles, and suddenly sometimes a big fire come to me, and then they would consider me as a part of, I am not a part of their community. It's a big challenge. And not only that, Ms. Muhammad Imran, that when I really want to show my empathy to them in the intellectual terms, learning together, people will not believe me. They don't trust with my empathy. That's kind of challenge that I face in Indonesia. What should I do then? Then sometimes I just ignore that people say, you are just, I try to ignore them, that just to keep going, that to give my empathy to the others. Just like now in 2-3 minutes, I have a class with different of, they're waiting for me right now. So we talk and different again. Sometimes, well, by the way, Imran, and just before COVID, that I organize a friend of mine from different religion, Muslim. Most of them are Muslim, are participating with the pray in the church, which is very taboo in Indonesia. You will never find in Indonesia that you are with your traditionals wear and then go to the church and practicing their pray and participate with the praying, and then inside the church, which is not common in my country. We did that as a sympathy. Just give some such of learning to my community. What's supposed to be done, in practice of your empathy, as Professor Catherine mentioned. I think that's what she mean in the term of her sympathy. That how you can feel, different religion in the most sacred, sacred holiday, that you participate with them and you enjoy that. But in the other hand, when you're coming out from the prayer and everything, then people will talk different things. And the most funny thing, Muhammad, this most funny thing is that as a friend that I invite them, they said, Sapri, we are still Muslim now? I say, yes, we are. we just try to give them the empathy. We share with them. That's all my experience in Jakarta.
Thank you. I think
Thank you.
it's about experiential learning, and I remember this term passing over, where you actually experience the religious community life of the other. But that's where Chulin also earlier mentioned about you have to be prepared in case you decided not to come back. What do you do? How do you deal with the dilemma, right? But well, I really empathize with the very hard work that you have to do, and I hope you remain safe and you are able to continue doing your work. It's a challenge. I don't want to keep you any longer. Your students are waiting for you. So thank you so much, Sapri. We hope to engage you again. I'll just have 2 more questions and we'll end. And then there's one interesting question for Chulin, because in your bio data, you mentioned that you are a secular humanist. How do you address the notion and misrepresentation that religions have the ultimate monopoly for empathy? And since today's topic also, it's about inter-religious empathy. So coming from someone who is a secular humanist, and people always say that, all these good values actually are rooted in religion. But for someone with no religion, how do you deal with that? And is that something that needs to be addressed openly right now?
So there are a number of ways to address this, and it depends on how punchy I am feeling right now. But I saw that question on Facebook, and I want to say thank you to the person who asked it, because it allows me to say something I forgot to say just now, that when we talk about empathy, here we're talking about interreligious empathy, and I talked a little bit about why we say no. The fundamental start of that is also empathy towards the self, right? When we participate in inter-religious dialogue or anything, right? What is my positionality? What is my availability to myself and to the other, such that I can participate? So I think, quite honestly, sometimes the question that was asked, my answer is no, I will not engage, because in this particular context, it is much better for my health and my well-being that I do not engage, for all the reasons that I talked about above, right? I am overwhelmed, my work is very hard, I don't think I will be heard, I don't think this question is reciprocated, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to realize that no is a completely rational and compassionate answer for yourself, because you're not good for yourself or anybody that's sort of like crispy and burnt out. The slightly more complex answer is, well, you have friends, right? So I know the person who asked the question doesn't actually think that of me. If he actually does, we will reassess our relationship, right? And I'm only saying this half jokingly, but like, having that relationship is very helpful, because it puts me in a network of people, so that I know that I'm not having this conversation by myself. There are other people who understand where I come from. I'm not sort of shouting into the void. But also, I think a lot of it is experiential, right? That we are friends first, and then we talk philosophy and beliefs slightly later, and then we see, okay, now that you know this of me, what do we say about each other now, right? I think in my personal experience, people who just want to say things about me have no actual interest in understanding me as a person or humanists as a community. So I care about them in so much as their speech influences my ability to exist in a public space, but I try not to let them take up my sleep, because they don't care about how well I sleep. I care about how well I sleep. So that's a conversation that does need to be had. And then I'm just going to be like sneakily semantic over here. When I introduce myself, I almost never say that I am not religious. And when I introduce other people, then I tend to say, oh, traditions and faiths, because my own personal belief is, a God, a theistic belief is part of our belief system, but we have values and they count for something. It is part of my personal integrity that I talk about where my values come from. So I will tell you that it was very important to my upbringing that I went to Christian-run schools. And I will tell you that I learned my meditation from Buddhist teachers. It's an important part of my integrity, but for For somebody else to take all of this and put me in a box is a different kind of problem.
Thank you so much for that explanation. One last question, and after that, I will ask Professor Catherine to just sum up based on her observation so far. Well, how do you respond to this statement? I truly empathize with you. Henceforth, I seek your ultimate salvation in the hereafter. How do you address this notion of empathy as a way to proselytize and convert people? I mean, I can say I empathize with you, and therefore I love you, and therefore you need to come with me, enter my faith, and therefore we all be happy in heaven together. Maybe this will be best answered by Reverend Herman.
I think here you have a classic example of hermeneutics. Sure, there are certain references, and I'll speak now just from the Christian perspective, that lies at the foundations of a system of belief, a doctrinal thing. But of course, there's a way of speaking about it, and there's a way of living about it. And surely you do not want to turn God into a tribal God, that some are chosen, some are not. You do not want to make that God is the one who sets up the barriers, and God is the one who is causing conflict and division among human persons. So it's in the actual interfaith dialogue. In our case, if we are talking about that, it could be an intra, and then we struggle with it. So there are lots of studies and documents that go with it. It's a very enriching one. We have moved as a Christian church through much engagement in interfaith to avoid certain language, to look at a whole perspective, and to rediscover certain theological concepts in a broader setting. And then, of course, you have the other reality where people are using it ideologically, and it fits into a political agenda. And this, I think, plays out in many contexts, and this is sad because then it's related to a certain notion of empire, or certain notion of superiority, or certain notion of dominance of West over the East and South, global South. So I think this would fit into something. When you talk about empathy, you talk about context, and it has to be unpacked. So it's fascinating in the dialogue partners to see the kind of language and the kind of text they use for each other.
Thank you.
So a case in point, of course, in Malaysia, we have the problem with the use of the word Allah. Right? You see, so in many other contexts, in many other parts, our neighbor has no problem with that, although the majority of the nation is Muslim. So that's contextual, you know. So we have to start from that and move beyond. And of course, even the Muslim scholars would say their God is not tribal, their God is generous and kind and compassionate to all beings. So how do you weigh that once against the other?
Yeah, very interesting. Of course, Professor Catherine has been discussing and telling us about the conditions for interreligious dialogue to happen, and one of the components is for empathy to be part of that conditions. And of course, hearing from Reverend Herman, it seems that this needs to be extended to intra-faith issues also. Intra-faith empathy is something that has not been fully investigated. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you are much more vicious and violent towards your own community because you want to represent the truth within that representation of the community, right? So you see in many faiths, for example, the Sunnis and the Shias, and even in some cases, in the past, especially between Protestants and Catholics and various other religions too. So that is one element maybe we can explore in another time, but I'll just now let Professor Catherine to just give her concluding words from this very fascinating discussion. Prof?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this fascinating discussion. I don't know if I have concluding words. I just want to sort of come back to some of the questions that were raised before that were also really fascinating. First, the last point about intra-religious empathy, I think I was indeed also emphasizing in my presentation that it's often much more difficult to empathize with somebody who has a different interpretation of your own religion than to empathize with somebody in another religion. So a monk, a Christian monk and a Buddhist monk can empathize much more easily with each other than they can sometimes with fundamentalists in their own respective traditions, right? So it's sometimes a matter of the interpretation and the type of experience within a religion that allows for bridges between religions, I think. So that's certainly a very important point. The point about I fully empathize with you and therefore I seek your salvation is an interesting one. So I think that is in some ways a fully legitimate way of being. So what I'm after is it possible? So it's really an epistemological question. Is it possible to enter into the experience of the other? And there are various degrees of it, and it's never fully possible, and so forth. But a believer will, by nature, believe that their tradition is the best way to salvation. And so you can try to empathize with the other, and it can go in a particular depth. And then you can still say, yeah, but my religion is still the best. Empathy doesn't mean that you give up all your beliefs. So you can still then argue, but those are two different questions. So one is about theology, the other one is about epistemology. And so I think they can fit together in particular ways, and they don't necessarily exclude each other. They don't require each other either. I can just empathize with the other without trying to convert them. But I can also empathize and then at a different level sort of still want them to come to understand the truth that I think is the ultimate truth. I don't think believers have the ultimate monopoly on empathy at all. I think, non-believers certainly can have a very deep level of empathy. In some ways, I think believers have a bigger obstacle insofar as they have to overcome their own doctrinal prejudice towards the other. So I certainly don't think believers have the monopoly on empathy. And I thought Saprisali's comment was really interesting and illustrates exactly what I was saying, that it's very threatening to empathize with the other, to enter into their religious space and try to enter into their worldview, and then possibly lose or have a sense of threat to one's own religious identity. And that's precisely why it's so difficult, sort of those doctrinal, institutional, ritual boundaries between religions that keep us from really entering deeply into each other's experience. And that's precisely sort of the barrier that I'm trying to explore and break through by sort of requiring greater openness. It's possible to enter into each other's space, religious space, without feeling threatened. But there's a kind of doctrinal understanding of the other and the space of the other that has to be overcome in order to make that possible. So it's a very complicated and difficult question, but I still think in spite of all of the challenges to empathy, there's a real possibility and richness to further trying to understand the other from within, and for reasons that I laid out in the beginning of my lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I believe that to show empathy requires courage, and that is something that I hope our listeners will take away with, and to embody that as best as possible in our everyday lives, in our connection with others, with communities, and in our own personal life, and also, like what Julian has mentioned, to also empathize with our own selves, and to be kind to our own selves, which is very important as much as we show kindness to others or empathy with others. So this has been a very rich discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Catherine, for indulging your time with us. I know it's very early morning there. I hope, I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. And thank you, Chulin, also for your wonderful insights, and to Reverend Dr. Herman Shastri also for very insightful comments. And of course, I would like to offer my thanks also to my co-convener, Dr. Adis Dudarija, who had to leave earlier, and also to Ustad Sapri Saleh. So we'll be in touch again, and thank you everyone, and a very wonderful day ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you.